He was the kind of man audiences couldn't forget, bold, square-jawed, and relentless. In the golden age of television, Robert Conrad strode across the screen like a figure carved out of granite, commanding attention with a steely gaze and a voice that hinted at danger just beneath the surface. As James T. West in The Wild Wild West, and later as Pappy Boyington in Baa Baa Black Sheep, he became synonymous with grit, charm, and a brand of masculinity that seemed born of a different time. To millions, he wasn't just acting, he was the role. But off camera, a different story was unfolding. Robert Conrad's life was never as smooth or scripted as the shows that made him famous. Beneath the rugged charisma and confident swagger was a man who lived a life of extremes, marked by fierce love, quiet rebellion, untold personal battles, and a desperate search for peace. He was not merely a performer, but a husband, a father, a dreamer, and, in time, a man shaped by both the light and shadow of fame. Born into hardship on the south side of Chicago, Conrad carried the scars of an early life that offered little softness. He learned to fight for everything: his name, his future, and the right to be taken seriously. That fight would follow him through Hollywood's narrow hallways, shaping not only the roles he was given, but how the world saw him. As a real-life tough guy, a man impossible to ignore, and equally difficult to truly understand. His story is not one of overnight success, nor of quiet decline. It's a journey that took him from backlit brawls to family-filled ranches, from bold defiance in youth to fragile dignity in his final days. Along the way, he broke hearts, took risks, loved deeply, and paid dearly for both his strength and his flaws. In the end, Robert Conrad's life wasn't a television show. It was something far more complex, more human. There were no easy resolutions, no last-minute heroes. Just a man who lived boldly, stumbled painfully, and tried to hold on to something true amidst it all. This is the story behind the legend, the life behind the mask, and the quiet legacy of a man who dared to live on his own terms until the very end. Long before the sound stages and the spotlight, Robert Conrad was just a boy named Conrad Robert Falk, growing up in the working-class neighborhoods of Chicago. Born in 1935 to teenage parents, his earliest memories were shaped not by security, but by struggle. His father, Leonard, worked in a chocolate flavoring plant in New Jersey. His mother, Jacqueline, a determined and fiercely independent woman, carved out a career as a publicist. But the marriage did not last. When the two parted ways, it was Jacqueline who bore the weight of raising young Robert alone. In those days, the streets of Chicago weren't forgiving. Toughness wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. Jacqueline knew this, and she raised her son accordingly. There was little room for softness in their home, but plenty of room for discipline and ambition. When she remarried, Robert was sent to live with his grandmother, adding another layer of distance and complexity to his early emotional life. Still, the boy refused to falter. Discipline became his armor. As a teenager, he attended a military school that reinforced the values of order, resilience, and control. These lessons would stay with him long after the uniform was gone. And yet, even then, there were hints of the performer he would one day become. He carried himself with a certain presence, a self-assuredness that made people look twice. Beneath the strict exterior, there was an undeniable magnetism. At just 15 years old, brimming with pride and restlessness, he made a decision that startled everyone around him. He enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. The move was bold, even reckless, but it was pure Robert, decisive, fearless, and unwilling to wait for life to give him permission. It didn't last. When officials discovered he had lied about his age, he was promptly discharged. The rules, after all, were clear. But for Conrad, it was never about following the rules. It was about testing his limits. This brief stint with the Marines didn't bring shame. If anything, it hardened his resolve. He returned home more determined than ever to prove that he was someone who could not be broken. A series of odd jobs followed. He worked on the docks, delivered milk, toiled in factories, each task undertaken with grit, each setback met with stubborn will. Still, somewhere beneath the rugged exterior, there was a yearning for something more. He didn't just want to survive. He wanted to matter. That desire, quiet and persistent, would guide him out of Chicago's steel shadows and toward a different kind of battlefield. The stage, the screen, and the hearts of millions. In a city built on muscle and noise, Robert Conrad stood apart, not because he shouted louder, but because he carried within him something deeper. A hunger, a spark, and a belief, even then, that he was meant for more than the streets that raised him. In many ways, Robert Conrad's first great love story mirrored the kind of drama that would later unfold on screen: impulsive, passionate, and wildly improbable. At just 17 years old, still carrying the weight of a rough upbringing and a restless spirit, he met Joan Kenley. She was polished, refined, and came from a family of wealth and stature. Her father was a successful attorney, and her education had been shaped by the quiet discipline of elite Catholic boarding schools. Conrad, on the other hand, was a college dropout scraping together wages, searching for a place to belong. Their worlds could not have been more different. And yet, when their paths crossed at Northwestern University, the connection was immediate. It was not caution that guided him, it was instinct. He dropped out of school, bent the truth about his age once again, and married her in secret in 1952. He was 17. She was 19. They weren't supposed to work. But for a time, love seemed to make up for what life had denied them. Because Joan's family disapproved, the couple made themselves nearly invisible. They changed their names and lived in quiet obscurity, shielding their young marriage from scrutiny. It was a time of hand-to-mouth existence, marked by second jobs, tiny apartments, and a constant search for stability. Conrad worked wherever he could, unloading cargo, driving delivery trucks, clocking in at a candy factory. He didn't complain. He had a wife to care for and soon, a child on the way. There was no stardom in sight then. No contracts or cameras. Just a young man willing to do whatever it took to prove he was enough for the woman he loved. But even in this modest life, trouble found him. After organizing a petition at the docks to challenge a corrupt union steward, he was fired. Another door slammed shut. Still, he didn't wallow. He turned once again to something that had quietly followed him since boyhood: his voice. He sang in cafes and lounges, experimenting with stage names and ballads, looking for any open microphone that would let him try. The odds were long. His voice was good, but the industry was crowded and he had no connections. Until fate, once more, placed the right person in his path. That person was Nick Adams, a young actor on the rise with a sharp eye for talent and an ear for grit. Adams saw something in Conrad and made a promise that would change his life. He would help him break into Hollywood. And he did. By 1957, Conrad had landed a contract with Warner Brothers. His pay, $250 a week. To a man who had once delivered milk in the dead of winter to support his family, it felt like fortune itself. The long days of secrecy, of scraping by, had finally given way to something brighter. But with the promise of fame came new expectations and a new kind of pressure. And as Robert Conrad stepped into the light of Hollywood, he carried with him not just ambition, but the memory of a love that had defied the odds and the sacrifices it had taken to chase a dream. Hollywood in the late 1950s was a town of polished smiles and polished scripts, where charm could open doors, but only if you had the steel to walk through them. Robert Conrad had both. With a Warner Brothers contract in hand and his young family depending on him, he arrived in the studio system not as a wide-eyed dreamer, but as a man already tempered by life's hardships. And it showed. His first major role came quickly. He was cast as Tom Lopaka, a suave private investigator on the hit television series Hawaiian Eye. The show, with its exotic setting and smooth pacing, became a vehicle for Conrad's natural charisma. Audiences were drawn to his lean frame, square jaw, and the quiet confidence he carried into every scene. But it wasn't just his looks that kept them watching. There was something else, something untamed, as if the actor had one foot in the world of fiction and the other still planted firmly in real life. What set Conrad apart from his peers was not polish, but authenticity. He wasn't pretending to be tough, he was tough. He did his own stunts, refused body doubles, and pushed his physical limits beyond what even the most seasoned stuntmen dared attempt. It wasn't bravado, it was belief. If the script said he was supposed to leap from a rooftop or throw a punch in close quarters, he would do it himself without hesitation. That same year, he also ventured into music, releasing several singles under the name Bob Conrad. With slick back hair and a baritone voice, he captured a slice of the teen idol craze sweeping the nation. But unlike other studio-molded pop stars, his appeal wasn't built on softness. It was the same magnetic toughness he brought to the screen. His brief music career never reached the heights of his television success, but it was a reminder of his versatility and of the many roads he had once considered taking. Then came the role that would define him, James T., West in the Wild Wild West. Part Western, part spy thriller, the show was unlike anything else on television. Conrad's portrayal of the daring Secret Service agent was equal parts grit and elegance. a man who could throw a punch in one scene and trade wits in the next. He brought an electric presence to the screen, commanding attention without having to shout. Viewers didn't just believe him, they trusted him. But the set of the Wild Wild West wasn't just a workplace. It was a proving ground. Conrad saw every scene as a challenge, every fight choreography as a chance to raise the stakes. Behind the scenes, he built deep friendships with cast and crew, earning a reputation as both a leader and a risk-taker. There was a sense of camaraderie, but also a silent understanding. This was a man who didn't take shortcuts, and he expected the same from others. As the show's popularity soared, so did Conrad's fame. Magazine covers, interviews, public appearances, he became one of television's most recognizable faces. Yet, despite the glamour, he kept his family close and his circle tight. He hadn't come to Hollywood to be adored. He came to work. And work he did, with a discipline forged not in drama school, but on the streets of Chicago and in the long hours of obscurity. His breakthrough wasn't just a stroke of luck. It was the reward for years of sacrifice, grit, and belief in something better. But as the spotlight grew brighter, so did the shadows that fame often casts. And soon, Conrad would find that the very image that built his career would begin to define and confine the man behind it. By the early 1970s, Robert Conrad had become more than a television actor. He was an emblem of American grit. To fans, he wasn't just playing tough guys, he was the tough guy. And while that image made him a household name, it soon became a double-edged sword, one that cut deeper than most would ever see. For years, his career thrived on roles that celebrated physical strength, fierce independence, and quick retaliation. His characters solved problems with fists more often than with words. It was what audiences expected and what producers wanted. But Conrad began to feel boxed in by this persona. He could be more. He was more. Yet when he stepped outside that mold, the world didn't always welcome it. In 1971, he took on a new role in The DA, a courtroom drama created by Jack Webb, the mind behind Dragnet. Gone were the cowboy boots and the choreographed brawls. Instead, Conrad appeared as Paul Ryan, a district attorney clad in suits, arguing cases in clean, measured tones. The role was respectable, even noble. But to the audience who had grown accustomed to his fist-first approach, it felt unfamiliar. The reaction was muted. Critics were polite, but fans seemed puzzled. The show was canceled after just one season. Conrad wasn't deterred. He believed in the role, and in his ability to grow beyond the expectations placed on him. But the message from the industry was clear. They wanted the brawler, not the barrister. And more often than not, life began to imitate art. Out in the world, strangers treated him not as an actor, but as the characters he portrayed. In restaurants, on the street, and in bars, he was approached or challenged, not with admiration, but with provocation. Some simply wanted to shake the hand of a television hero. Others, emboldened by drink or bravado, wanted to test the mettle of the man behind the myth. In one instance, a group of men blocked his car on a narrow road, hurling insults and daring him to react. He tried to brush it off, accustomed by now to such encounters. But when words turned to confrontation, Conrad was forced to defend himself, again blurring the line between who he was and who the world imagined him to be. Even in high school, long before stardom, he had faced this kind of friction. Despite his athletic prowess, his love of music drew jeers from teammates. They mocked his choir practice, kicked him under the table, and laughed behind his back. He never confronted them directly. Instead, he waited until football drills, when the pads were on and the whistle blew, and hit just a little harder. There was always a tension in his life between vulnerability and performance. He loved deeply, spoke plainly, and cared fiercely for those close to him. But the world, having seen him tumble from trains and leap from rooftops, expected invincibility. And that expectation, over time, became a burden. He couldn't show pain. He couldn't soften. He had to be Robert Conrad, unbreakable, unstoppable, untouchable. But no one can carry that weight forever. As the years passed, the very image that had built his career began to isolate him. Offers grew more predictable, and opportunities for reinvention grew scarce. Still, Conrad pressed on, committed to his craft, loyal to his family, and quietly nursing the wounds that came with a life lived always on the defensive. Behind the spotlight, behind the fistfights and fame, Robert Conrad was still the boy from Chicago, scrappy, principled, and forever trying to prove that there was more to him than anyone ever cared to see. In a career defined by bright lights and high stakes, Robert Conrad's greatest refuge was found far from the glare of the spotlight. As his fame grew, So too did his longing for silence, for something simpler, something real. And so he built a world of his own, tucked away in the pine-covered hills of Bear Valley, California. Nestled on 100 acres of rugged land, his mountain retreat stood in sharp contrast to the sound stages and backlots of Los Angeles. There were no agents here, no studio executives, no tabloid cameras waiting by the gate. Just trees, wind, and a man slowly learning how to put the noise of fame behind him. Conrad lived simply. The property had no television, no radio, and no telephone. Most would have called it isolation. He called it freedom. The ranch wasn't just a place, it was a state of mind. A return to the values that had shaped him before fame ever found its way into his life. He chopped wood. He rode horses. He sat in stillness. For a man so often defined by motion, stillness was a radical act. But he did not retreat alone. In 1978, while hosting a pageant in Atlanta, Conrad met a young woman named Lavelda Fan. She was 17 at the time, the reigning Miss National teenager, and he, then 43, was still married to his first wife. During the event, he joked with her on air, asking when she would turn 18. It was a moment that would follow them, both in memory and in myth. A week later, they began speaking. In time, that conversation grew into a relationship, and in 1983, they married. The union raised eyebrows. The age gap was significant, and the circumstances unconventional. But for Conrad, Lavelda offered something rare: honesty, loyalty, and a willingness to follow him away from fame and into the mountains. Together, they made Bear Valley their home, raising 3 daughters, Camille, Chelsea, and Kaya, in a town so small it barely registered on a map. Life in Bear Valley demanded commitment. The winters were long, the community small, and the distance from Hollywood absolute. But Lavelda embraced it. "You've really got to be into a guy," she once said, "to want to move with him and live this kind of life." For Conrad, her presence grounded him. Her steadiness softened his edges, and their daughters gave him a second chance to do fatherhood the way he wanted. To outsiders, the retreat seemed like an escape from a fading career. But to those who knew him, it was something far more personal. It was the quiet life he had never known. A life measured not in Nielsen ratings, but in quiet dinners, snowy walks, and the laughter of his children echoing off cabin walls. Still, the outside world never fully let go. He continued to act in limited roles, hosted a syndicated radio program, and remained a presence in the lives of fans who remembered him fondly. But his heart was no longer in the spotlight. It was in the hills, in the wood smoke and stillness, in the rare contentment of having finally outrun the roles that had once defined him. For Robert Conrad, Bear Valley was not a retreat. It was a reclamation, the act of taking back his own story, not as a star, but as a man. In the twilight of his life, when many of his peers had retired quietly into legacy and reflection, Robert Conrad faced a moment that would change everything, not just the course of his career, but the course of his very being. On March 31st, 2003, at the age of 73, he was involved in a devastating car accident that would mark the beginning of a long and painful decline. That evening, Conrad was driving his 1995 Jaguar along Highway 4 in California. For reasons that would later become painfully clear, he crossed the center line and collided head-on with another vehicle, a 1990 Subaru driven by Kevin Allen Burnett. The damage was immediate and severe. Both drivers sustained critical injuries. But as paramedics arrived and the scene was examined, another truth emerged. Conrad's blood alcohol content was measured at over 0.22, nearly 3 times the legal limit. The legal system responded swiftly. He was charged with 2 felony counts: driving under the influence and operating a vehicle with a blood alcohol concentration above the legal threshold. Though his court date was postponed to allow him time to recover from his injuries, the gravity of the situation was undeniable. In November 2004, Conrad pleaded guilty. The punishment included 6 months of house arrest, 5 years of probation, mandatory alcohol counseling, and a ban from entering any bar. He was also ordered to pay fines totaling over $3,600. It was a sobering moment in every sense of the word. But for Conrad, the consequences were not just legal. They were physical and permanent. The crash left him with multiple injuries requiring repeated surgeries and intensive rehabilitation. When he appeared in court, he did so leaning on a cane, one arm in a sling, his movements slow and labored. He had once leapt from rooftops without fear. Now he struggled simply to walk. A letter from Santa Clara Valley Medical Center confirmed the extent of the damage. partial paralysis, diminished mobility, and neurological impairment. His speech faltered. His memory grew cloudy. And slowly, the man who had once commanded every room he entered became quieter, more withdrawn. He never regained full use of his left arm. Most days, he relied on a wheelchair. The emotional toll, too, was immense. Friends and family observed a deep depression settling in, one born not only of injury, but of shame. Through it all, Conrad expressed concern for the other driver. He prayed openly for Burnett's recovery, a rare glimpse into the gentler spirit that had always existed behind the hardened exterior. But the accident had changed him. He no longer sought attention. He stopped taking roles. His syndicated radio show, once a point of connection between him and his fans, faded into silence. For a man who had once defined himself by his strength and motion, the loss of mobility was not just a physical blow. It was a quiet, relentless grief. In many ways, the accident marked the end of his public life. And though he served only a portion of his sentence, the real punishment was internal. The independence he had so fiercely guarded throughout his life had been taken away, not by age, but by a single moment of recklessness. In the years that followed, Conrad would try to hold on to fragments of normalcy. But the world around him grew smaller, more still. The man who had once fought to escape every limitation now lived within one. Silently, painfully, and with a humility that few had ever seen before. Though Robert Conrad's later years were marked by physical pain and quiet retreat, the bonds he forged with his family endured. Beneath the swagger and the stunts was a man who took fatherhood seriously, perhaps more seriously than he took fame. With 8 children spanning 2 marriages, his home life was full of energy, discipline, and the kind of structure that echoed his own austere upbringing. From his first marriage to Joan Kenley, Conrad had 5 children: Joan, Shane, Nancy, Christian, and Christy. Despite their divorce, Joan remained a trusted advisor and manager of the family's finances, even long after the romance between them had faded. Their partnership had evolved into something pragmatic and grounded, tied together by the shared responsibilities of raising a large family in the public eye. Later, with Lavelle DeFan, his second wife, Conrad welcomed 3 more daughters: Camille, Chelsea, and Kaya. Though his marriage to Lavelda ended after nearly 3 decades, she would remain a central figure in his life, particularly during his final years. Her tribute to him after his passing, tender, poetic, and deeply personal, spoke volumes about the bond they had shared. In interviews, Conrad's children often described him as strict but loving. There were rules in the household, many of them. His daughters attended Catholic school. Dating was not permitted before 16. Rooms were to be spotless, manners impeccable. But he also made time to teach life skills. He insisted that his sons learn to iron their clothes, and his daughters were not exempt from physical training. For all his toughness, he wanted his children to be self-reliant, prepared, and above all, honorable. Hollywood may have been his workplace, but it was never his escape. He brought his children to set whenever possible, inviting them into his world rather than shielding them from it. Christian fondly recalled being raised on the set of The Wild Wild West, where he lived out boyhood fantasies on the studio backlit. Shane spent time on Baa Baa Black Sheep, watching his father perform stunts with the same intensity he brought to parenting. As they grew older, some of the children chose to follow him into the entertainment world. Joan became a television producer. Shane and Christian acted alongside their father in various projects. Perhaps most notably, in the late 1980s, Conrad developed a series called High Mountain Rangers, centered on a mountain rescue unit. The show starred himself and both of his sons, a rare glimpse into the blending of his 2 most enduring identities, actor and father. It wasn't always easy. Fame complicated things. Expectations weighed heavily. But through it all, Conrad remained present in the lives of his children, even when the world outside seemed determined to forget him. He was proud of their successes, protective of their struggles, and quietly content with the lives they built. Beyond the family, Conrad also turned to service. Before his passing, he was recognized with the Distinguished Service Award in broadcasting. He became active in causes that mattered to him: veterans organizations, health initiatives, and community efforts to help those living with disability or chronic illness. He was especially devoted to the Wounded Warriors Project and the Paralyzed Veterans of America, causes that spoke to both his early years in the Marines and the challenges he faced after his accident. These were not grand gestures. There were no cameras following him, no press releases or headlines, just quiet action done in earnest. A man known for his brawn was now defined by his giving spirit. In his final chapter, Robert Conrad left behind more than a body of work. He left a family that had grown strong under his care, a legacy of service to those in need, and a lesson in endurance, not just on screen, but in life. As the years passed and the world outside continued to race forward, Robert Conrad's life slowed to a gentle hush. No longer the bold young actor vaulting from saloon balconies or trading punches in stylized brawls, he spent his final chapter far from the cameras, tucked between the quiet corners of Bear Valley and the coastal calm of Malibu. It was not a retreat in shame, but a return to stillness, a kind of private reckoning with the life he had lived. His Malibu home, though modest by Hollywood standards, offered a view of the sea and the soft hush of waves. It was not the lavish estate of a star still seeking attention, but a quiet perch for reflection. The man who had once charged through scenes with physical force now moved with effort, his body weakened by the long shadow of his 2003 accident. He walked with assistance. His voice, once firm and certain, faltered, and his memory, sharp for so many years, began to blur around the edges. But even in decline, Conrad remained unmistakably himself. Stubborn, proud, resilient. He did not seek pity, nor did he pretend that all was well. When asked, he spoke plainly of the pain, the limitations, the regrets. Yet there was no bitterness in his words, only clarity. He had lived a full life, reckless at times, fiercely principled, unafraid of consequence. The accident had changed him profoundly. His physical struggles were visible to all who saw him in his final public appearances. The wheelchair, the slowed gait, the distant gaze. But those closest to him knew that the deeper change had taken place within. He had grown quieter, more contemplative. He no longer felt the need to defend a reputation or uphold an image. He had already proven everything he needed to. La Velda, though separated from him by then, remained deeply connected. Her tribute after his passing was tender and stirring, a slide of memories accompanied by words that spoke not just of love, but of transformation. "Because of you," she wrote, "I know I can be bruised but not mistaken. Another's opinion cannot measure my worth." It was not just a farewell to a husband, but to a mentor, a guide, a complicated man who had taught her how to survive the storms of life with integrity intact. Robert Conrad passed away on February 8th, 2020, from heart failure at the age of 84. He died at home, surrounded by the quiet he had long cherished. The announcement came not with fanfare, but with reverence. He was survived by 8 children and 18 grandchildren, a lineage as strong and varied as the man himself. In his final years, he gave fewer interviews, made fewer appearances, and slowly faded from the public eye. But those who knew him never forgot the depth of his character. He had been many things: a star, a husband, a father, a fighter, and in the end, a man at peace with what he had built and who he had become. The world remembered Robert Conrad for the image he projected, the fearless agent, the iron-jawed hero. But in the quiet of his later life, it was the softness that lingered, the gentle silences, the still mountain mornings, the moments with his children and grandchildren, unrecorded and unremarked but deeply felt. For a man once defined by motion and noise, the silence became its own kind of triumph. Robert Conrad's life was never one of half measures. He lived boldly, worked fiercely, and loved with a kind of reckless sincerity that left its mark on everyone who crossed his path. His career may have been shaped by the roles he played: agents, soldiers, fighters, but his legacy rests not in the characters, but in the contradictions that defined him. Tough but tender, private but principled, flawed yet unforgettable. He came into the world under modest circumstances, built his life from sheer determination, and rose through a ruthless industry without losing sight of who he was. Fame never softened him. If anything, it made him more resolved to protect the parts of himself that remained untouched by celebrity. And when the lights began to fade, he didn't chase them. He walked away. The accident that changed his body did not diminish his spirit. In fact, it revealed something far more enduring than the muscles or the jawline. It revealed humility. It revealed grace. For a man once celebrated for his physical power, it was perhaps his quiet endurance that proved most remarkable. Robert Conrad didn't seek redemption in the public eye. He found it in the quiet corners of ranch land and family, in the honest work of raising children, in supporting veterans, and in living with the consequences of his choices. He never claimed perfection. He only claimed his truth. And maybe that is what made him timeless. His story reminds us that behind every screen legend is a human story, one made of hardship, hope, love, failure, and the everyday courage to keep moving forward. His face may have graced countless television sets, but his true impact was felt in smaller moments. A father teaching his son to sew, a man chopping wood in the cold, a voice on the radio connecting to strangers with warmth and candor. The trail has ended, but the impression he left remains. On screen, he will always be the hero in the black suit, outwitting villains with charm and muscle. But beyond the frame, he was something rarer, a man who faced the cost of his own legend and lived on his own terms all the way to the end. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories of Hollywood's golden era.